Hello everybody. It's been a while since we did a video, but I'm here tonight with a special guest, Caroline Norma. Thanks so much for being here to talk about what I haven't said we're talking about yet, which is left-wing men.
Thank you for inviting me, Holly. How could I ever miss the chance of speaking about left-wing men? As if we don't do it every day. Such a great
This
topic.
ragging on left-wing men is long overdue in my opinion, so I've been really looking forward to this.
Building a whole movement around that could actually be a possibility after this recording.
Yes, please. Yes, please. So we're gonna get straight into it. We're starting with a paper from, I'm just popping up this magazine / pamphlet, whatever it was. So there was notes from the first year, and then this is the second edition, notes from the second year, published in 1970. And the piece in question is by Alan Willis, and it's called Women and the Left. And I just thought this would be a really perfect place to start and introduce some of the themes that we'll be talking about through different pieces in the video. So I'm going to just start by reading like the first few paragraphs of the article, and then I'll say a bit more about the rest of it, and then Caroline and I will have a little chat about it. So here's the first three paragraphs, and if you want to look it up for yourself, we'll put the link in the video description, and it starts on page 55. So she writes, "The women's liberation movement was created by women activists fed up with their subordinate position in radical organizations. The first goal was to take an equal, active part in the radical movement instead of being relegated to secretarial and other service chores. This circumstance has led to certain assumptions about the women's movement. In the standard radical view, women's liberation is a branch of the left, and women are a constituency like students or GIs. Granted that we suffer our own forms of oppression and that radical men have oppressed us as women, the emphasis is on contributing our special insights to the left as a whole and using feminist issues as an organizing tool. In return, male radicals are expected to endorse women's liberation and combat their male chauvinism. Many of us now reject this view of our purpose as anti-woman. We have come to see women's liberation as an independent revolutionary movement, potentially representing half the population. We intend to make our own analysis of the system and put our interests first, whether or not it is convenient for the male-dominated left. Although we may cooperate with radical men on matters of common concern, we are not simply part of the left. We do not assume that radical men are our allies or that we want the same kind of revolution they want." So I should have said before I read that a little bit about the terminology in this piece, because it might otherwise be confusing. When she talks about radicals and radical organizations, she means leftists and leftist organizations. So she seems to be using those terms interchangeably. So for her, a radical means something like a revolutionary, and the leftist organizations at the time were the revolutionaries, which I think we'll come back and talk about later in the video when we see how much this view applies today. So when she's encouraging women to leave the left and establish a radical feminist movement, she means an independent feminist movement that is itself revolutionary. So I think those ideas that we've already seen are important because they give us an insight into what it was like for women within the left at the time in the late 1960s. And we're going to hear more about that as we go on, in particular when we talk about Andrea Dworkin's experiences. So Willis is saying that women were marginalized within leftist organizations, relegated to secretary and service work. And then initially, women only wanted to be treated as equals instead of as secretaries within the leftist movements. But later they realized women's liberation was its own separate movement. They're not just part of the left, and they will not any longer put the left first, which tended to mean sacrificing women's interests for men's.
And it was extraordinary that she used the word, labelled that movement as she envisaged it, the revolutionary one that is independent from the left and has its own separate revolutionary goals, as radical feminist, and that was in 1968. I thought that, I mean, obviously the political label radical feminist did exist by then, but only just, I would have thought. So that was amazing to see.
I thought that was very interesting too. Like, it's almost a different meaning, but then that's the meaning that got given uptake, right? Like, I was sort of trying to figure that out. It's like, yes, she doesn't quite mean radical feminist as we know it, because she means let's be revolutionaries, women. But then that is kind of what the radical feminists, capital R, capital F, kind of came to mean, right? So yeah, I wonder whose terminology it was, or if people took it up after that. I mean, I'm sure they were all reading those two magazines, right?
Yeah, and the fact that it was printed in The Guardian seemed weird, and that it got letters in response, to which obviously Willis then responded back to. And I don't know if we want to go into that, but her response back probably reflected more of the limits, even though she'd named radical feminism, named it as a radical movement, like you're saying, but then her response to the criticisms that she got from that initial piece sort of revealed her agenda to be more of an anti-capitalist kind of traditional Marxist type version of women's radicalism, a little bit, which, I mean, limitations for that stage in history are quite fine, but I thought that was, it explicated the kind of the way that she was using that phrase a bit more.
Yeah, maybe. That's really helpful. And I don't think I said that, but I should have, that this article first appeared in 1968 in The Guardian, and then is republished in Notes for the Second Year in 1970, just so as you say. Do you want to say so? Because I don't think I read the replies. If you want to say something about that.
The replies don't resonate with today, I think, because they were objecting to her criticism of the New Left, and it's, they thought she was objecting to the anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, anti-Vietnam War of the movement that the women belong to, and therefore her response to I think I didn't see the replies, but I did see her response to it. The reply was very defensive in that she reiterated the fact that they were against capitalism. She could envisage women coming together as radicals to work against capitalism. She even goes so far to say that. So it wasn't a sexuality discussion, which probably is about right for, Ellen Willis then went on to be pro-pornography and that, so I suppose it makes sense.
And it makes sense of the timeline, right? Because they have very much yet to sort of figure out exactly what their issues are and what's distinctive and fully break away from Marxism. And so, yeah, you would expect that kind of messiness. So I was going to say, one thing that I thought was interesting is this tension that still shows up a lot today, right? Between feminists kind of who want to center what they see as their conception of what is about women, like women's sexuality or things to do with femaleness, coming up against these left, I call them left purists, but we could just say left centering feminists or whatever. It was interesting to me that she talks in the article about that being in full swing at the time, and that we still have that now, even after all this sort of work has been done. So she talked about there being this plan for a protest where there was division between the women because some of the women wanted to inform the leftist men that they were sick of participating in other people's revolutions and they now would be working for themselves, while the other women, she says, were horrified at the thought of criticizing the movement publicly, which means kind of going up against the left publicly. And then I just thought I'd tell the watchers, assuming there are any one day, that about this event she describes in the article, because this just has stuck with me since I first read it, the treatment of the feminists at the time by the leftist men. So she's saying that the previous conception, right, as I've already set up, was supposed to be that women within the left are a constituency, and they're giving their insights, and they're using feminist issues as an organizing tool, and the exchange is supposed to be that in return men are sort of challenging their own chauvinism and signing up to the women's liberation idea or cause. But she describes how when this relevant leftist organisation put an ad in The Guardian listing what its issues were, it failed to list women's liberation. And then when it printed out its program for this upcoming rally that the women had planned this action for, it didn't put the women's action on the program. And then she writes about the sort of event as it happened. She says, during our presentation, men in the audience booed, laughed, catcalled, and yelled enlightened remarks like, take her off the stage and fuck her. Instead of reprimanding the hecklers, as he did during an unpopular speech by a black GI, the host tried to hurry us off the stage. So that somehow like just has stuck with me the whole time. And I think it's going to relate to things we talk about a bit later with Dworkin, where it's like you sort of expect these, you know, these leftist men, they're sort of anti-violence and they're anti-war, and they support the Black liberation movement, and they understand injustice and oppression and they're against it. And yet this way that they are treating women or countenancing other men treating women, it's just like they've got this blind spot exactly in this one place. And somehow there's some dissonance, right? Because it's like you sort of expect better of them given their other commitments, and then it's worse that they're just as bad as every other man. That really stood
that they can act acceptably act in solidarity with populations. Well, I mean, I know they're acting in solidarity with populations of men, but conceivably those populations do include women. But the women can, you know, conceivably closest to them as their comrades, or at least we're thinking of them as our comrades.
Right.
They're the ones who they're turning on. I mean, that makes no sense. It's just obviously women's complete misunderstanding of the political relationship that we stand in relation to them. But it's it's still sad and betraying.
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose it just I mean, I guess the charitable view, right, will be like, oh, it just shows how much people at the time thought that these sex distinctions were natural, right? Because even your self-styled justice people couldn't perceive that, like, maybe the woman isn't for the secretarial labor, like maybe she has a brain and she could contribute strategy at this meeting, right? And the fact that that doesn't even occur to them. So it's like, okay, these differences, nature looks like culture looks like nature, right? And even to them, even to the people that are supposed to be able to detect that stuff.
But it reflects regression, doesn't it? Historically speaking, doesn't it reflect regression on part of left-wing men, in that they did have the example of the Bolshevik Revolution, the quite decent texts that came out of Marxism and the Bolshevik Revolution, August Bebel's book on, women and sexuality. There was a whole tradition that they were supposed to be part of. The New Left was supposed to be, inheriting of that, but they went backwards. So, there were better sex-based relations during the Bolshevik Revolution than the New Left managed in the West.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah.
That's very interesting.
From all historical accounts.
Yeah, okay. That's even more depressing then, because it was somehow like a weird blind spot in the progressiveness. But yeah, now it sounds like there's even less excuse, right? Because other men before them or in other movements had managed to see a bit of that, or there was theory on that, or then it looks worse, right? Like willful.
And I think and I know, obviously it was against the Vietnam War and imperialism and capitalism, so therefore it is. I mean, in fact, factually speaking, surely it has to be connected with that left of the Bolshevik Revolution, in political terms. But then again, the New Left was about, obviously, as we're going to talk about, pornography and libertarianism and sexual access to women and all of sort of the innovation of the New Left, I think fundamentally split it from, the old Marxist left, I suppose. But then they were the ones calling themselves the left, so they should be held to their own kind of labelling. Yeah.
Interesting. Shall I say a little bit more, or shall we go on to our next victim?
Next victim is Robin Morgan. Maybe this is a good place to go on, because she just builds on Willis really nicely. So this was a piece published in 1970, and it's got a very interesting context because it was published in a magazine that had just been taken over and effectively seized, and the publisher's office occupied by leftist women, and they ended up publishing a new edition of the magazine as it was run by women. And this piece by Robin Morgan called Goodbye to All That, which people will be familiar with, was published in that new edition of the new women-run version of the magazine. The magazine was called Rat, and it was a early underground, new left, male-run, New York-based, had connections to Columbia University, one of the underground newspapers from that movement, and a fairly famous one and well-known one, a major one actually in history. But as Robin Morgan, I've got an ambulance coming in the background, sorry. Robin Morgan described at the time, and I'll read out. So this book, the book in which I've taken the Goodbye to All That from is called The Word of a Woman, Feminist Dispatches, 1968 to 1992, which is by Robin Morgan. And it's got two editions, one in 1992, one in 1994. And it's worth looking at the 1994 edition, I think, because it's got a preface to the article written by Robin Morgan. And that preface has got some very interesting information in it. But what happened, I'll just quickly read out what she says about what happened with the magazines. This is just from the preface. So she says that as the flower children's style of the middle 1960s coarsened into the confrontational tactics of the late 1960s, male attitudes were solidified in leftist consciousness, and being tough, heavy, and street fighter became prerequisites for being a radical, either male or female. So Rat, and that's the magazine, reflected these changes and began presenting as well a kind of cultural nationalism for young white males, new priorities of rock music coverage, pornographic articles and graphics, and sex-wanted ads, euphemistically called personals, began to clog the pages. So it's at that point, that change in the mid-1960s for the magazine, that then prompted the leftist women who were involved to take it over. And Morgan had been involved as a freelance contributor, but not on the committee. So the leftist women had apparently brought her in under the guise of saying, we need women's liberationists to help us run this new magazine now that we've taken it over. But then, and this is just, sorry, I'm reading a lot, but one more thing that was from the preface that was really probably important to our discussion today, Robin Morgan says, sometimes, this is her reflecting back in 1994, sometimes I wonder how I could publish my parting statement. So the goodbye to all that is a parting statement. I'll mention it in a minute. Sometimes I wonder how I could publish my parting statement to the male left in the first issue and then remain for a full year on such a leftist newspaper. Yet I know the answer. In Goodbye, so Goodbye to All That, the piece, I was saying farewell to working with men in the left. I could not have foreseen that working with leftist women on male left defined issues of importance would be not much different. Besides, I myself was not that free from a traditional Marxist analysis. My political priorities were largely defined by guilt for whatever I was not doing at any given moment. So anyway, I think we can talk about that sort of crucial distinction. Probably that was the building upon Ellen Willis's kind of analysis that I thought maybe Robin Morgan innovated in her piece. That was 2 years after Ellen Willis. So it's a great piece, absolutely wonderful. I think women today would like to read it. The piece is a litany and a list of references to various left male endorsements of sexualized, pornographic, woman-hating, misogynist kind of either speech or products. It's a little pornographic photos that they were producing in various things, or the things that they'd done, their relationships with women and with the way that they were treating their girlfriends and wives. It's a great big list of all the things that they were doing. So a lot of it, if you read it, you kind of don't really understand the details. She mentions groups and people's names and things that you can't know about, but the general, you definitely get the general idea that she's pointing to, one thing after the next that these left men were doing at the time. But that's very interesting. But I like the theorising of the piece, actually. So I don't know what you thought, Holly, I'll see what you thought, but I really liked her. So it wasn't just the Ellen Willis kind of call to we need an independent revolutionary movement separate with our own goals and organising. But Robin Morgan goes further and says, this is a quote from her, let it all hang out. Let it seem bitchy, catty, dykey, frustrated, crazy, nutty, frigid, ridiculous, bitter, embarrassing, man-hating, libelous, pure, unfair, envious, intuitive, low-down, stupid, petty, liberating. We are the women that men have warned us about. I mean, so she just encourages women, we're not going to be respectable. They're always going to say those things about us. Let's go with that. Yeah. I don't know what you thought, Holly, though.
No,
I love that.
I love that too. Yeah. And it's actually, it's strategic in a way, right? Because there's something about like these false ideal, I think we've talked about this in other spaces, right? But like these false ideals, like if you read the wrong feminists early on and you get this like, oh, this like amazing sisterhood and everyone's like lovely with each other and it's all going to work out, then you go and actually do feminism, right? Like I remember this because I was like, you read the dedications at the start of some of their books and it all sounds like so great, like this really amazing sisterhood and mutual support, and then you go and actually do it and you're just getting like stabbed from all sides and like there's just like nefarious conspiracy theories and like everything is absolutely bonkers. And you sort of feel like it would have been good to be warned. So I sort of really like it for that reason, that it's like, look, it's going to be a calamity, but we're here together and we're doing it, and let's just do it however and whatever they say. I love. Yeah,
that's it, isn't it? We can't be the male left, or the way that the male left likes to imagine themselves, because they're all
not the way they really are. Yeah,
and if they are, maybe they are organised and unified in that, but they're doing that through mobilising around their common interest in pornography and all sorts of fun things for them. So we don't have that organising kind of subordinate to organise around, maybe. But I agree with you.
I thought what you said earlier about the stuff in the preface was really interesting too, like that disappointment of thinking that women will be different, but then just finding leftist women who have internalized that ideology and sort of brought it along. And I'm kind of interested in, the extent to which that is just what's going on. Like, is it that these women today, where we see that, that's just kind of where they came up, and so that it's really hard to throw that off at a certain point? Like, so even if you want to center women, it's just really hard to get free of whatever the first cause was, where you I don't know, I know I'm not articulating that perfectly, but it's like, is it just hard to escape an ideology for anyone, and is that what's going on? Or is it like, no, those things are so obviously good, like being anti-war or pro-social equality or whatever, or against the rich, like whatever we make it today. It's like, that's so tempting that you wouldn't sort of want to see yourself as sacrificing that to choose women. I don't know.
Ellen Willis, no, that's such a, because Ellen Willis in her last paragraph, you'll remember, says that she wants to make that a rule of the new women's independent revolutionary movement, that she says at the end, so we must remember to always prioritise, or at least take into consideration, the opinions of women who haven't come from any male-affiliated organisation or something. Otherwise, will we become just reactionaries instead of something that's a little kind of directive. It's a funny little paragraph.
That's right. So she says, it is not only possible but imperative for women to build a specifically feminist radical consciousness. as radicals, we must do our best to foster this consciousness, but we should have the humility to realize that women who have never been committed to a male-oriented radical analysis may have clearer perspectives than we. Unless we shed our movement prejudices and help women's liberation go its own way, we will not be a revolutionary vanguard, but reactionary obstructionists.
That's just what you said, Holly.
Yeah, it's very prescient, right? Like that's prescient and not heated. I think it was what
not
I
heated.
When I read it, like really not heated. And yeah,
what's intersectionality been for the past 10 years, if not that?
Yeah,
I think.
Or even, I mean, I still see this today where it's like women will present themselves as radical feminists, or maybe sometimes nowadays as gender critical. And of course, you know, we can argue about what those things mean, but I often think they don't even know that what they mean is socialist feminists or Marxist feminists or leftist feminists, whatever the right exact demarcation is. So they don't even have a conception of themselves as actually doing the interlocking style of pre-Crenshaw, what I think of as pre-Crenshaw intersectional feminism, which is where you brought like one other one along with feminism, or two or three. So whenever you're a eco-feminist, right, you're marrying your ecological commitments to your feminism. But people were upfront about that. Like the Black feminists were upfront about marrying the two together. So if the socialist feminists or leftist feminists all just said, we are hybrid cause feminists and we also bring along the left, that would be fine, because the just feminists, the McKinnon feminism unmodifieds, or what I think of as the rad fems, they could just be like, oh cool, now we know how to track the lines of our disagreement. You've brought two friends along, causes, and I've only got one, and I just want to cooperate with you on the ones we have in common and leave your leftist stuff out of it. That's not for me. But we don't, because they are both presenting themselves as rad fems, and then this type of rad fem pretends that this one should be anti-capitalist. It's just bizarre.
That's brilliant. I hadn't thought of it that way, but you're right. The earlier way of doing, the pre-Crenshaw way, at least we knew where we stood and what we were supposed to be collaborating on.
Right.
That's just great, Holly. I like that. Yeah. And it's funny that, probably back then we sort of, I don't know, I think myself even might have then said, oh, stop getting bogged down in your different, your identities by, putting everything out front. I'm a socialist, ecologicalist, whatever, anti-colonialist, feminist. Oh, stop with all that labelling. But no, I was wrong. That labelling was good.
I kind of think so, yeah, because, and I think, we, I find it helpful, right? Like, I don't know, I think Leah Keith is a good example, right? She's like very upfront about being an environmentalist feminist. Like these are her, she's written books in both areas and she combines them together. But I don't think that she would show up to a rad fem meeting or whatever and then be trying to put the environment first. Like I just doubt that that's what she's doing. And of course people can try to convince other people that their hybridization is the right set of moral commitments, but that's another thing from respecting that they're not the same as another person's and that you haven't yet convinced them, or just trying to work on what you have in common. So I perceive it as a really odd problem at the moment that maybe the fairer way to put that would just be like the leftist feminism is still seen by many as a live candidate for being radical feminism, and so there's no way to really articulate like feminism unmodified, which is across the spectrum. So we keep having these same debates over and over between the leftist purists and the rest. And my sense is that the disapproval's slightly on the side of the Kelly J types who are across the whole spectrum just caring about women. But I think they are the ones that are getting it right. And that's the leftist feminists who should be more upfront about their friend that they're bringing. Yeah.
Correct, or at least expected to demonstrate the means by which their friend can be understood by radical feminists in sexuality terms. That's the nature of the politic. It's all about sexuality. unless it can be understood in those terms, then it's another issue that we can debate as to whether it should be part of the sexuality.
Yeah. No,
at least we've got to put it in our terms for it to transmit, surely.
Yeah. I don't even think they would try to tell it in sexuality terms. I think if pushed, they would admit there's just capitalism, right? And wealth stuff and environment stuff, and that's all terrible. Or there's systems of oppression, and the real radical has got to be committed against all of them rather than just picking their favorite one, women. So I feel like if pushed, they would admit that it's a whole separate thing. And the question is, do they have a further story to tell? Of course, people have further stories. Like, I think Bell Hooks is going to say, yeah, but it's all entwined, right? So you have to be for against all bads. You can't just pick your favorite. Okay, well, that's at least a story. But if that's not true,
it's an argument.
I think it isn't, then and we're not having any of that argument at the moment, are we?
Correct. That's it. And it's just put in term. It's isn't it just used as a tool rather than argument to attempt to gain ground over or to aggrandize certain people in the movement and put down others, or it's kind of more wielded as a tool rather than a explanation about what our movement is. And I think you're right.
Do you want to say anything else about Morgan, or should I go on to Dworkin?
I think we can go on to Dworkin. Just probably one more thing that actually links to Dworkin really well. Already by 1970, I was just really impressed with Morgan here. Already by 1970, she was saying, to become a true revolutionary, one must first become one of the oppressed, not organise or educate or manipulate them, but become one of them, or realise that you are one already. No woman wants that, because that realisation is humiliating. It hurts. And so she has a few sentences and paragraphs in the piece about, women and our unclean bodies and our mad brains and all of our wild hair flying, wild eyes. We're all one of the same class, and therefore we should recognise each other and us being all together, not above one or the other. And then the way that she speaks about women in the traditional left are women in male left captivity, or the counter left captivity, which I thought was really a nice way of saying it.
That's nice too. Yeah, it's also, it's not blaming, is it? It's sort of almost more like, they're stuck for now, but maybe they'll get free.
and she does say that we must cultivate our movement so that they have somewhere to go, and that we welcome them when they come, and that it's a good environment and nice space and all that. So cool. Exactly.
That's really cool. So the next thing, I'm just popping up the cover of, so this is Andrea Dworkin's novel, actually, with some scholarly debate over whether and how autobiographical it is. I was telling Kate in another video that I'd just been reading it as entirely true. I can't remember if we emailed about this, but then there was this bit in it where she's like, and then I died. And I was like, I had to reframe my entire set of beliefs about how to read the novel. So maybe I'm like too credulous a reader, but really amazing book either way, however much it is true and however much is literature. So I'm going to read just a couple of there's a few pages, and I'll skip a bit in the middle, but it's kind of a commentary both on her experiences working for the peace movement at the time, so the sort of anti-Vietnam leftist organization, but also a commentary on how rape was conceptualized and understood at the time. So she's sort of almost saying that it's a thing that has to be so bad that it basically never happens, or it couldn't be the thing that happened to her. So these two themes, she's kind of wrestling with them at the same time. And again, this just showed to me like the sort of insanity of what these like self-styled justice types are able to perceive as a wrong and not. So it just, really stood out. So I'll just read a bit of that. So she says, and for anyone who has the book, this bit starts on page 46. I wasn't raped really until I was 18, pretty old. Well, I wasn't really raped. Rape is just some awful word. It's a way to say it was real bad, worse than anything. I was a pacifist, and I didn't believe in hurting anyone, and I wouldn't hurt anyone. I had been 18 for a couple of months, of legal age. It was winter. Cold. You don't forget winter. I was working for peace groups and for non-violence. It wouldn't be fair to call it rape. To him, it wouldn't be fair to him. I wasn't a virgin or anything. He forced me, but it was my own fault. I was working at the Student Peace Union then and at the War Resisters League. I typed and I answered phones and I tried to be in the meetings, but they didn't really ever let me talk, and I helped to organize demonstrations by calling people on the phones, and I helped to write leaflets. They didn't really believe in rape, I think. I couldn't ask anyone or tell anyone because they would just say how I was bourgeois, which was this word they used all the time. Women were it more than anybody. They were hip or cool or hipsters or bohemians or all those words you could see in the newspapers on the Lower East Side, but anytime a woman said something, she was bourgeois. I knew what it meant, but I didn't know how to say it wasn't right. They believed in non-violence, and so did I, 100%. I wouldn't hurt anybody, even if he did rape me, but he probably didn't. Men were supposed to go crazy and kill someone if he was a rapist, but they wouldn't hurt him for raping me because they didn't believe in hurting anyone and because I was bourgeois, and anything that brought me down lower to the people was okay, and if it hurt me, I deserved it, because if you were a bourgeois female, you were spoiled and had everything and needed to be fucked more or to begin with. At the Student Peace Union, there were boys my age, but they were treated like grown men by everyone around there, and they bossed me around and didn't listen to anything I said except to make fun of it, and no one treated me as if I knew anything, which maybe I didn't, but the boys were pretty ignorant pieces of shit, I can tell you that. I was confused by it, but I kept working for peace. These boys all called Mama at home. I heard them. I didn't. There were adults, some really old, at the War Resisters League, but to me, they weren't anything like the adults from school. They were heroes to me. They had gone to jail for things they believed in. They weren't afraid, and they didn't follow laws, and they didn't act dead, and they had sex, and they didn't lie about it, and they didn't act like there was all the time in the world because they knew there wasn't. They stood up to the government. They weren't afraid. One had been a freedom rider in the South, and he got beaten up so many times he was like a punched-out prize fighter. He could barely talk. He had been beaten up so much. I didn't try to talk to him or around him because I held him in awe. Then I'm just skipping down a little bit to the bottom of page 48, and then I'll just read the last little bit. Is it okay to go on, or do you want to intersperse?
Yeah,
okay.
It's brilliant.
So she says, but when the boys who wanted to be conscientious objectors came in for help, there were always a lot of jokes about rape. I didn't see how you could make jokes about rape if you were against violence. Maybe rape barely existed at all, but it was pretty awful. The pacifists and war resisters would counsel the conscientious objectors about what to say to the draft boards. Vietnam was pulling all these boys to be killers. The draft board always asked what the COs would do if their mother was raped or their girlfriend or their sister, and it was a big joke. The pacifists and the COs would say things like they would let her have a good time. I don't remember all the things they said, but they would laugh and joke about it. It always made me sort of sick, but if I tried to say something, they wouldn't listen, and I didn't know what to say anyway. Eventually, the pacifists would tell the COs the right way to answer the question. It was a lofty answer about never using violence under any circumstance, however tragic or painful, but it was a lie because none of them ever thought it was anything to have their girlfriend raped or their mother. They always thought it was funny, and they always laughed. So it wasn't violence because they never laughed at violence. So I'm not sure if rape even really existed because these pacifists really cared about violence and they would never turn their backs on violence. They cared about social justice, they cared about peace, they cared about racism, they cared about poverty, they cared about everything bad that happened to people. It was confusing that they didn't care about rape or thought it was a joke. But then I wasn't so sure what rape was exactly. I knew it was horrible. I always had a picture in my mind of a woman with her clothes torn, near dead, on the floor, unable to move because she was beaten up so bad and hurt so much, especially between her legs. I always thought the Nazis had done it. The draft board always asked about the Nazis. Would you have fought against the Nazis? Suppose the Nazis tried to rape your sister. They would rehearse how to answer the draft board, and then when it came to the rape part, they always laughed and made jokes. I would be typing because I never got to talk, or they would act irritated if I did, or they would just keep talking to each other anyway over me, and I felt upset, and I would interrupt and say, well, I mean, rape is, but I could never finish the sentence. And if I'd managed to get their attention, sometimes by nearly crying, they'd all just stare and I'd go blank. It was a terrifying thing, and you would be so hurt. How could they laugh? And you wouldn't want a Nazi to come anywhere near you. It would just be foul. The Nazis, I would try to say, trying to find a way to say, bad, very bad. Rape is very bad, I wanted to say, but I could only say, Nazis are very bad. What's bad about fucking my sister, someone would say, always, every time. Then they'd all laugh. So I wasn't even sure if there was rape. So I don't think I could have been raped, even though I think I was raped, but I know I wasn't because it barely existed, or it didn't exist at all, and if it did, it was only with Nazis. It had to be as bad as Nazis. I didn't want the man to be fucking me, but, I mean, that doesn't really matter. It's just that I really tried to stop him. I really tried to not have him near me. I really didn't want him, and he really hurt me so much. So I thought maybe it was rape because he hurt me so bad, and I didn't want to so much, but I guess it wasn't, or it doesn't matter. Just like, fuck.
Yeah, and it's that for the whole book too.
Yes.
Utterly brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, like such a like punch in
so many levels.
Yeah. But one thing that really struck, I mean, there's a lot of things, but one thing that really struck me was the finding things to call women to put them down. They're like, she's just bourgeois, she's just some bougie. Like the fact that they've been doing that all along, like that, I was like, oh, wow, that's interesting because now it's privileged, right? Like now in our circles, it's like, they'll just say like, she's privileged. That means she's white usually, right? Or she had any kind of a comfortable upbringing. So there's always these ways, and they just apply to women. There are ways to write women off. So you have to be exactly the right woman to even get any say at all. And I don't know, I found that interesting, that it was like, oh yeah, okay, the word changes, but the trick of finding ways to dismiss women or not listen to women,
and to convince women themselves, and convince women themselves that they're not worth standing up for themselves. I mean, isn't it the most insidious problem that we've got within feminism, or women who could be part of our movement that won't stand up for themselves, they don't believe themselves worthy of standing up for, but precisely because of these kind of labels, and you've had life good just by virtue of you're still alive and you're, I don't know what, not homeless, and the bar's pretty low. And also, I don't want to jump away from that amazing passage, but just to let people know that all the while that she's written that passage, not too far after that, you get the information that these left-wing guys were keen to get their comrades out of prison after, being picked up in protests or various things they raced, apparently, to get them out of prison. At the same time that women comrades in the movement had also gone to prison, but they just left them there and didn't worry about them, even though they're the ones most at risk in prison.
Yeah.
But apparently raced to get their male comrades out because they worried about them being raped.
That it's just so disgusting, because then you see the view, right? But that's what women are for. But it would be a travesty if it happened to a man. So we really need to help don't worry about the women, but this really shouldn't happen to a man. It just really it's the patriarchy is fraternity point as well, right? Like, who do they see? Who's visible to them? Who matters?
When does the left ever make arguments against prostitution unless it comes to so-called transgender women in prostitution who are represented in prostitution, and then prostitution becomes a problem.
Which just proves the whole point. Yeah, anything for the bros, but otherwise don't worry about it. It's really quite sickening.
Even when they're not bros.
But it sort of like illustrates the that it's just lip service, right? Like they're yelling trans women and women, but the very fact that they are moved to do something about that, but not about anything to do with women, Yeah, it's really interesting.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I don't really have more to add, I think, than I've already said about Willis, because I just have this open question about how that's possible, right? Like what Dworkin's observations at the time, like how can it just looks so hypocritical for these men to be anti-violence while um, not anti-rape. I mean, in this specific case, um, and then the earlier thought was like, yeah, anti pro justice or pro equality, but not able to see women's issues as falling in that camp at all. So yeah, maybe it has the same answer. Like it's just so naturalized that it's invisible, or it works in their interest, so they have no interest in seeing it. I don't know. I guess there's many explanations, but it's gross. It's really gross.
And even in the current day, I just, read everything in the current day in her discussion as well, that when you read, these famous guys writing books on political economy, for some reason I've read lots of them, so pornography is never mentioned, even though it's these guys who before us even, and even now, would know much more about what's being done to women in pornography and what that industry is about. But they know, we didn't know. But they never mention it. And just reading them, but they're of course they're wonderfully critical of everything else: war, capitalism, environmental destruction, everything else, and that's good. But it's almost painful to read those highly, beautifully critical critiques of other human rights crimes, but never ever to mention, pornography, even though that's quite easily for everyone, all of them would have seen it. It's right there for everyone to see. Billions of hours of it, footage running non-stop, but they still don't mention it. Right. Even Dave Graver, I read all of his books, but I didn't read the Bullshit Jobs book till right to the end of the series. And then right at the end of that book, he endorses BDSM, dripping wax onto girlfriends. And I felt betrayed that I'd spent all those hours reading all of his books. I wish I hadn't read that one last. He's,
Why is that even in the... that's a...
Yeah, why
is it in the Bullshit Jobs book? What the fuck?
I know, anyway. Yeah, I don't want to divert from Dworkin's wonderful book, but really resonated with that book.
Yeah, it's an amazing book. I mean, and that is like, it's just a tiny part of it. It's not, and it would be something you wouldn't remember if you were reading it for any other purpose, but it just stuck out to me at the time, and then I can't remember, why. At some point I just thought we should talk about left-wing men, right? And I got in touch with you. So maybe it was around that time, but yeah, it just seemed like one of the things that should be in the mix of this discussion.
I don't think it's a marginal sort of, it's not just a little scenario within the book. I think it's, I don't know, I'm sure you would, seen it throughout, because then later on when the man that she marries, the character, she marries explicitly because she felt in solidarity with him doing political work.
That's true.
And she describes sort of this sort of sexual interactions with him as, it's just, we felt like one body and one person, and we were just in sync, and every muscle of our bodies were working together in wonderful ecstasy. Kind of, there's those kind of passages. And, at first you sort of read them, oh goodness, what's this? But no, keep reading, because this is my interpretation. I'm sure other people have different ideas, but I think she's writing that kind of thing to remind women we're so susceptible and vulnerable to misunderstanding our relationships with men, either solidarity relationships or personal relationships, as being aligned with them in common endeavour, building towards a common future humanity together. But we get tricked. That's not what they're in it for. We might be misunderstanding that we think that we are, but we're tricked. And so therefore any sort of, we're experiencing those feelings wholly on our side. But then, anyway, this guy ends up, of course, becoming a domestic abuser and just beating her to within an inch. Actually, within an inch of her life, she was nearly dead. And
horrific, yeah.
And then it's at that point, and then after that is when the story changes. I don't know whether you thought this, Holly, but I think the story changes dramatically after that, because she's realised, that was fake, that was false. All those feelings I had, were not right. But I don't know.
No, I think that's probably right. And the flavor of the men seeming nice or trustworthy. I think you're right. That then continues throughout the book, right? That art guy that she sort of gets rescued by, and then he turns out to be one of the worst torturers, and the cab guy that rescues her. You know, there's all these men where it's like
with an accent. Like I think that kind of came in where he's, you know, he might be one of the racialized types, but therefore is less of a, I don't know, I got that from it.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't pick that up, but yeah, that might be right. All these sort of benevolent seeming people men that might be different, and then they're not. Each one is worse than the last. Yeah. Should we go on to Perry?
Yes. Thanks for this, Holly. You chose the best lineup and selection of text to discuss this idea with, I think. And Perry's, was one that we read. So it's Louise Perry, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, A New Guide to Sex in the 21st Century, out this year through Polity, 2022. And Louise Perry is she's probably 10 years younger than me, so I suppose she must be in her early 30s. A journalist based in the UK. And the book has a foreword by Kathleen Stock. And on that basis, that gives a little bit of a clue as to some of the book's argument, but I'll just say a couple of things before mentioning that. So Louise Perry really nicely in the first chapter, the introductory chapter, really nicely nails liberal feminism for its problems. She does it in a really accessible way, beautiful writing, covers, the major problems. Liberal feminism is ill-equipped to respond to the problems precisely the problems that it objects to. So, rape, sexual violence, sexual harassment. Liberal feminists respond to these problems by bringing up the idea that if men just were educated a bit more, they'd learn not to do those things, and that response, or, sex offender retraining programs or whatever, and that response is, entirely unsuitable and ineffective. Is her first criticism of liberal feminist politics, that freedom and consent are prioritised above every other value and priority, and that robs women of the ability to prioritise things like safety, things like boundaries, because they keep having this pressure brought down from the ideas of sort of freedom and liberation, consent. And so therefore, liberal feminists have nowhere to go but to imagine sex to be a leisure activity and attempt to fashion themselves into men who chase after and do the same kind of sexual things as men do, but in our lives, obviously we're the subordinate class, we're not men, so it never works out because we can never be as blasé and oversexed as men, and so therefore the liberal feminist project is kind of circular and doomed from the start. So that chapter's great. I don't think it's a feminist book, though. I suppose there's no reason to say that. The reason is because the direction that Perry then goes in is to say, well, radical feminists have got it wrong because they've supposedly, I don't think this is actually true, but supposedly radical feminists have understood politics to be a matter of nurture over nature, and therefore prioritising the understanding of male behaviour as nurture, and if we just change that nurturing, that will change men. I don't think that's quite right, but I can see what she's saying. Yeah. And therefore we've got that wrong, and therefore we need to start understanding evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology, and understand that actually we need to come to terms with the question, and this is her writing, what if hierarchy and viciousness and violence are baked in? And she justifies that kind of question through saying that humans are full of hubris and consider ourselves to be above the animal kingdom, but really we're just animals and we should understand ourselves as behaviourally the same as those. So why wouldn't we have the same natural selection to select for men who are, she doesn't go as far as to say, natural selection selects for men who rape, but she does kind of say natural selection selects for men who have big, broad upper bodies, and heterosexual women are attracted to them, and therefore we sort of get men who have higher levels of what she calls sociosexuality, and that's a process through evolutionary biology, and therefore we must understand our circumstances in that way and enact responses, social responses and political responses among women ourselves to deal with that reality. Even though, I mean, I've sort of put the argument a little bit too bluntly there, even though at the same time, Perry is not, so she's keen to get women to exercise our boundaries on that basis. She's not, it's not kind of an old, you know, sort of pre-war argument where then, you know, an advocate might say, well, in that case, we just need to cater to men's sexuality. It's not that old argument, it's sort of a new one, but still on the basis of the same biological ideas. I don't know what you thought, Holly.
The question about, I think this is such an interesting disagreement, right? Or maybe that's not the right word, like methodological question about what things different feminists are allowed to assume are fixed and are not, right? So, you know, like this shows up all throughout the difference feminist discussion. Like, so who's wrong about how plastic human nature is, and then which things should we be optimists about being allowed to change? And I guess there's some value in everyone holding different parameters fixed, but being really clear that they're doing that, and then exploring, you know what I mean? Like if you just upfront and say like, oh, we just don't really have the evidence, so let's suppose that the human male is no different to the human chimpanzee, and then what should feminists be doing, right? They should be working around him rather than hoping he can ever be adequately socialized or something. I sort of get that methodologically you can just do that, and I think I often end up doing that, just saying I'm like a dreamer or whatever, so I'm not gonna be beholden to these like claims about how we're always going to be roughly like this. So there's something in that where I think that I wouldn't object to the methodology per se, but then it's a question about how much she's insisting that that actually is our situation, and whether she's offering adequate evidence to suppose that it is, right? And I take it she isn't, because it's not a science book. I haven't made it to the end, I have to admit, so correct me if I'm wrong, but if she's not showing why that position is true, rather than just a conditional she happens to want to start from, it's not clear where we land. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, perfectly. So you're worried about the extent of the evidence presented for that position. Well, no, I think in that case, maybe that's in her favour then, because no, I think she makes, well, I mean, it's not a science book, but probably enough for the type of book that it is. I don't think it's too unjustified. But my attention would then go to why she's making it for political purpose. But are you thinking that that's a later interrogation maybe? I wouldn't care how she's made that argument. But...
Oh, because I would have thought it's a pretty strong claim, right, to say... One thing is like I think it's fine to be pushing back on the like blank slate type view, like, oh, okay, these feminists, whether it's rads or not, have put too much in the nurture basket and not enough in the nature basket. But it sounds like she's making a much stronger empirical claim, which is that you know, human males are just like other males in other species, and they're going to be sort of highly sexualized and subconsciously motivated to procreate or whatever. And culture makes no difference. That's wild. Like, we are the only species that has highly advanced culture and language. And to say that that makes no difference to the biology, even if you want to fight about how much of any particular thing is nature and how much is nurture, I would have thought a lot of the argument rests on that move. And if she's not saying a lot in defense of that move, like, to justify why we should be so exceptionless about human males, then I don't see how the rest of the project would get off the ground. So that's why I was leaning on the empirical point rather than the political conclusion. But yeah, so you're thinking, where are you annoyed, or where is your objection?
No, you've probably persuaded me. I can see exactly what you're saying there, Holly. Very well put. No, that's right. But whether it's put strongly or well with evidence or not, I suspect that I won't say anyone, but I suspect that a lot of people, even if it's put weakly, kind of in the stop bigs kind of way, I feel like that and this is probably jumping over the question, sorry, but I feel like the aim of doing that is to then put a reconciliation type argument of reconciliation model of politics, whereby feminism is a project to create a world in which, in Perry's words, which will be very recognisable to anyone, how can we best promote the well-being of both men and women, given that these two groups have different sets of interests, which are sometimes in tension? And then there's sort of a lot of rhetoric around, how can we engage in, dignity of the individual, harmonious human relations, to care for children and care for society, and it's all of that kind of rhetoric. So I feel like, maybe there's something to be said about it. Are people like Perry imagining our politics to be one in which women work hard to reconcile and finding ways and sort of structures and means and institutions and in order to reconcile with men by pulling men up by the bootstraps, bringing them in, making them decent human beings? And maybe this is sort of a first wave feminists, did a little bit of this where they took the moral high ground, attempted to sort of hold men to a higher standard. I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I just think it's an entirely different model of politics than the ones we've been talking about, so far, where it's separate kind of liberate ourselves, worry about ourselves and liberate ourselves, because it doesn't matter what we're going to say to men. They're not, I think, we're not in a position to change their politics.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. I definitely conceive feminism entirely separately of men. And that, yeah. I don't know quite if that is stupid, right? Because of course, they are going to be around. So I guess it just, maybe it actually goes back to something that Willis said, right? That like, I see if I wrote it down. It was something like, we go off and do it until we're so strong. Yeah, that's it. She said, radical men have a power position that they will not give up until they have to, which I think is a really common thought, right? That people who have privilege will fight to retain it. So you can't expect social hierarchy to just like do the right thing. And then she says, all women can do is create strong enough independent movement that no revolution at all is possible without our cooperation. And of course, she's talking about the leftist men, right? They can't get their revolution that they want without the women because they're so numerous. But I think you could make the same point just about ordinary life, right? And I think that is my conception of feminism. We go off, we get strong, we figure out what we want, we do our own thing. And then the men just kind of have to go along with it because we're strong when we came back. Not came back in the, I don't mean we're all living on women's lands, but like we're sort of reintegrated. They don't really have a choice after that. We're equals now. And so we're not just doing what they want. So it's not a thing where our main project is fixing them or bringing them along or working around them with their specific evolutionary quirks or whatever. I don't know.
Robin Morgan says that as well in her piece, that we become the left, we are the left, and we become the left, and other people just have to join in the end. I think I agree too. I think that is my idea of feminist politics. So, but that I think is in tension with, for example, Mary Daly saying that we're just the background actors on this. We're the stage hands. We're the background. We're in the background. It's the men who are the actors are in the foreground. And I do agree with that too, that we're only the class that establishes the ruling class and will just be used and tossed away. And I think at one point in Mercy, Dworkin's got an amazing passage where it says, we're just the bait on the end of the fisherman's hook, just writhing there, wiggling around. That's the level that we're at sort of politically. So it's kind of intention sort of then, is our only possibility of improving our condition just to play off one group of men against the next.
Right.
If it happens that right-wing men are somehow giving us more concessions than the other group, then we go with that group in order to try and play them off against each other.
Yeah.
I can't reconcile those two ideas of feminism.
No, but it's true that it's interesting to have both in mind, isn't it? Like it's good for the people who tend to do it in that separatist style model to think about that other model, because it's certainly not how I usually do it, and I find it interesting. Yeah, maybe that's true, that if someone really has that much power consolidated over that long a period, you actually can't really just go off and do your own thing without them. Like, you're going to have to start working on subgroups of them, or like T. Grace Atkinson wanted to do, right? Like, have your actual military strategy, like start plotting, start spying, start getting to know the enemy. So it is. It's a new idea to me, right? That you would really have to like just take that as the fixed parameter and then think about how to change it, rather than like
not assume standpoint theory where we're just the knowing ones because we're the ones at the bottom who can somehow see everything about the oppressor. We're not in the same workplaces as them. We don't occupy the same positions in international institutions. We're not in the military, but nonetheless, somehow we know all about what they're doing. Studying the enemy. T. Grace Atkinson was great on that, I thought.
And then we assume that they're so desperate to get the correct epistemology that they'll come to us for the completion of the knowledge project. Oh, we found out that we were lacking a few little tidbits.
It's a nice hubris. I mean, we should be that confident with ourselves, but somehow we're only confident in ourselves and kind of distorted.
Should we go on before we finish? Because we're probably it's probably been about an hour or maybe a little more. But I was thinking we could talk about the sort of update of all this, because I guess apart from Perry, most of it is kind of around that second wave period, right? And I suppose, if I understand things correctly, you just tell me if this seems right, like the establishment was more the conservatives or the right, and the leftists really were revolutionaries or like unique minority dissidents at the time. And things have really changed a lot by now. At least in our countries, like the left is the establishment now, and the left has not really just got the narrow set of issues that it had back then. So there's this question about how to like translate the like left-wing men complaints, or like how much is that stuff just still true, but it's just got a broader agenda now, or worse because that's now hegemonic and those are the men in power, or better, or like, I don't know, I haven't really thought it through, but I thought it would be good to talk about how it's sort of been 50 years or something, and what do we think? Yeah, I guess what do we think about the way that is still true today?
I think you captured it perfectly, Holly. We are living in the past. If we are still talking about state repression in that kind of old pre-Vietnam War mode, which did exist, it's true, but in Western countries at least, I mean, I think everyone knows by now, don't they, that, or they've started to come to realise in really stark terms that the new left now occupies every organ of power, including the military. If we go on sort of the rainbow push within Western militaries as well, obviously they rule there as well. If they're ruling in militaries, then they really have secured global power. So the idea that we're now supporting the left or understanding feminism as aligned with the left or a movement of the left,
right,
that doesn't make sense. In that case, we're part of the ruling class.
Yeah, well, that's interesting, right? I mean, I take it like, if they were right, if they had the right set of values that we agreed with, we wouldn't just for the sake of still being revolutionary compared to them, be a breakaway. So it's not just to do with them becoming the establishment, it's also something to do with the way that they have failed to bring women's interests fully in or along, right? So or maybe it's both at once, but I guess I'm thinking like feminists could have somehow been respected and incorporated by leftist men, and then we could have won the culture war as the feminist left, and we'd all just be happy now and we wouldn't need any revolutionaries, right? Or the revolutionaries would be like of a different topic, like they're the ones about technology or something, or returning to anti-technology and wanting to slow things down, something like that, like just some other dissidents. So there's somehow like we still need radical feminists in Willis's original sense, like a revolutionary independent feminist movement, because the left has failed us, maybe in a slightly different way than they failed us then. Or yeah, I haven't quite got my thoughts together on that, but it's
And that's great, I think, because they failed. Lucky for us, they've been so brazen and craven that they've not just failed us, but they've failed the majority of the population.
Right.
And now, if we, through the gender critical movement, I mean, I just really, this is going to sound simple-minded, but I really believe it. We are, just by virtue of all the, pushback and harassment and cancelling that we get, we've emerged somehow as that opposition faction in opposition to the professional managerial class that rules the Western states, and we've kind of strangely attracted broad-based, or to some level of broad-based support, which never would have been conceivable back when Ellen Willis was writing that we would be a broad-based movement. That's the nature of being broad. That's the definition of it. We might not end up as recognisable for the new left kind of feminism was, but shouldn't we be happy about it? We should be happy for this chance, I reckon.
Yeah. It's so funny though, right? Because we, like what you just said, I think that it sounds right to me, but then it's like it positions us as the revolutionaries, as she would have seen it, while at the same time our own leftist feminists think that we're not left enough, the ones of us who are just for the whole movement and for women, and the whole left media are busy calling us reactionaries. So I just think that's quite hilarious on multiple fronts. Like, if it's right that this is the dissident group coming up against that new left and saying fuck this, but then we're like, just being totally misclassified by all these people both on the inside and the outside of it. That's a bit funny.
Isn't it amazing? Yeah, and the new left that emerged in the 1960s in the American Western countries, where was their oppositional counter movement that we now face? I mean, their oppositional counter movement, well, I suppose it's parallel to our situation because we are facing repression by the state.
Yeah.
Plus all of its organs, the media and the police and everything else. So I suppose it's exactly parallel, I suppose, but it doesn't feel like it. No. I don't know. Yeah, I haven't thought it through at all.
Yeah. Well, there's just more to be thought about, I guess. But
yes.
Yeah. Just final thought? What's your sense like if you had to be stuck in a 5-day conference with left-wing men or right-wing men, who would you choose?
Right-wing men.
Same.
The reason, because it's not ideological, it's not theoretical, it's just through experience. I have been stuck in rooms with right-wing men, and not obviously I can hear everything that's been said. So, having just talked to you for an hour, actually, I am involved in, unionism, and I do believe, obviously, I've got a lot of involvement with the left, funny enough, on economic issues at least, and obviously, generally men in Christian circles or conservative circles, obviously they've got entirely opposite views when it comes to economics, but everything that's been discussed now, of course, is social, and on a lot of the social points, including pornography, in my experience, that they will at least voice our opinions.
Yeah.
Whereas, perhaps I've been a little bit exaggerated there, but that would be my impulse, at least, anyway, at the moment.
That's mine as well. It's just averages, right? I mean, it's not like it's all men on either side, but yeah, in terms of my like sense of who I would be treated better by, respected more by, probably have more in common with on the things that I care about a lot at the moment. Yeah.
And not pushed out of the room. I mean, we wouldn't get in the room with I wouldn't. I spoke at a history conference, an Australian history conference the other day, nothing to do with any politic whatsoever, and still had there a trigger warning read out before my speech. I was the only one in the conference. Yeah. But this has nothing to do with anything. It had nothing to do with politics, but just being in the room. We can't even get into the room, I don't think, anymore, mostly.
I didn't know that was still going on, because I've got your experience in my book about the Sydney Marxism Conference or whatever it was, which one of the things about that just I found insane was like that I think I told you this, I looked through the program after they'd booted you out and it was like mostly men. So it's just that same old thing where they've found a way to excise like one of the 3 women or whatever it was. Just absolutely nuts. But I didn't realise that. Is it all still because of that 2016 article or whenever it was?
I don't know. I couldn't get a background story on this one. Yeah, I don't know. It was odd. It's just odd. Yeah, I mean, guess, nothing compared to your experiences, Holly. It was nothing, but just sort of.
Oh, I'm sure it was.
I think it's not actually a matter of our choice about whether we're on the left or not. I think is what it ended up to be.
Yeah, good point. Good point. We are not welcome for now until we get a new one going. Okay, it's been awesome to talk to you about this. Yeah, maybe we should.
Holly, it was great.
Hopefully, we'll get to do another video together soon.
Great, can't wait.
Okay, see ya.
See ya.